In 1889, Michigan farmland stretched endlessly under gray autumn skies, where families survived harsh winters through sheer determination and unwavering faith. But for 23-year-old Catherine Brennan, the approaching winter held no promise of warmth or hope. Standing in the kitchen of her childhood home, she clutched a letter that would seal her fate forever. Her own mother had written to prospective buyers, advertising her daughter like damaged livestock at a county fair. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Healthy woman, excellent cook, reads and writes well, cannot bear children due to medical condition, seeking arrangement with a respectable family willing to provide room and board in exchange for household services. The words burned Catherine's eyes as she read them for the third time. 4 years of marriage to Robert Brennan had produced nothing but monthly disappointment and growing shame. Each passing season without a pregnancy had made her feel smaller, more worthless, until even her own reflection seemed to mock her failure as a woman. Her father, Charles Dalton, burst through the kitchen door with mud caked on his boots and exhaustion etched into every line of his weathered face. Behind him, her mother Margaret followed with the grim expression of someone about to deliver terrible news. "Pack your belongings, Catherine," her father announced without preamble. "We've found you." The word situation hit her like a physical blow. Not a new home, not a fresh start, but a situation, something to be managed and arranged, like hiring seasonal help or selling excess grain to neighbors. "Where?" "Oh," Catherine whispered, though part of her already knew the answer would break what remained of her heart. Margaret Dalton smoothed her apron with nervous hands. "The Hendersons live 40 miles east, near Grand Rapids. They have 4 children and need help managing their household after Mrs. Henderson passed away in childbirth last spring." "You don't understand," Catherine said, her voice rising with desperation. "I want to stay here. I can help with the farm, with anything you need. I don't have to be a burden." Charles's face hardened like winter soil. "You are 23 years, old with no prospects and no children. Your husband divorced you publicly, telling everyone in 3 counties that you're barren as salt earth. What man would want you now?" The cruel words settled over Catherine like a heavy blanket, suffocating her protests before they could form. She had lived with this shame for 2 years since Robert's abandonment, watching neighbors whisper behind their hands whenever she appeared in town. "The Hendersons are offering fair compensation," Margaret added quickly, as if money could soften the blow of being sold to strangers. $20 and board for 6 months' work. That's more than most hired help receives. Catherine stared at her parents, these people who had raised her, taught her to read, shown her how to tend animals and grow vegetables. Now they looked at her with the same calculating expressions she'd seen them use when deciding which livestock to sell before winter. "When?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the wind rattling the windows. "Tomorrow morning," Charles replied. "James Henderson will arrive with his wagon at sunrise." The finality in his tone left no room for argument or negotiation. Catherine climbed the narrow stairs to her childhood bedroom, each step feeling like she was ascending to her own execution. The small room held everything she owned in the world: 3 dresses, her mother's old sewing basket, a few books she'd managed to save when Robert threw her belongings into the yard, and a silver locket that had belonged to her grandmother. As she folded her meager possessions into a worn canvas bag, memories flooded through her mind like water through a broken dam. She remembered being 12 years old, helping her mother deliver a difficult calf, her small hands steady and sure as she guided new life into the world. She remembered teaching her younger cousin to read, watching his face light up when letters finally transformed into words that held meaning. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else entirely, some confident girl who believed she had value beyond her ability to produce children. That girl had died slowly, month by month, as doctors shook their heads and whispered about damaged wombs and divine punishment. Catherine sat on her narrow bed and opened the silver locket, studying the tiny portrait of her grandmother inside. Elizabeth Dalton had been a midwife, beloved throughout the county for her skill in bringing babies safely into the world and her gentle way with frightened mothers. What would she think of her granddaughter now, passed from family to family like an unwanted burden? A soft knock interrupted her dark thoughts. Margaret entered without waiting for permission, carrying a cup of tea that smelled like chamomile and honey. "I know this seems harsh," her mother said, settling on the edge of the bed, "but the Henderson children need care, and you need a place where your condition won't matter as much." Catherine accepted the tea with trembling hands. "My condition? You mean my failure to be a proper woman?" Margaret's face crumpled with something that might have been regret. "Your worth isn't measured by babies, Catherine. You're intelligent, capable, kind-hearted. The Henderson children will be fortunate to have you. Then why are you sending me away?" Catherine asked, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "If I have worth, why can't I stay here where I belong?" Her mother looked toward the window, watching darkness settle over the farmland they'd worked for generations. "Because your father sees you as a reminder of failure. Every day you remain unmarried and childless, neighbors ask questions. They wonder what's wrong with our family, what we did to deserve such disappointment." The honesty was brutal, but somehow cleaner than false. Comfort would have been. Catherine drank her tea in silence, tasting the bitterness of unwanted truth beneath the honey's sweetness. "Tell me about the Henderson family," she said finally. "If I'm to live among strangers, I should know something about them." Margaret's expression brightened slightly. "James Henderson is 35, a widower since his wife died, bringing their 5th child into the world. The baby died too, leaving him with 4 children ranging from 6 to 15. He owns a successful lumber mill and has a reputation for treating his workers fairly." "What are the children's names?" "The oldest is Michael, 15, followed by Sarah at 12, then the twins David and Daniel at 9. They say the children have been managing mostly on their own since their mother passed, with help from neighbor women when possible." Catherine tried to imagine 4 children attempting to maintain a household while grieving their mother's death. Her own situation suddenly seemed less tragic when measured against their loss. "What happened to Mrs. Henderson?" she asked. Margaret's voice grew quiet. "Complications during childbirth. The baby was breached, and by the time they could fetch a doctor from Grand Rapids, it was too late for either mother or child." The story sent chills through Catherine's body. She thought of all the times she'd prayed for pregnancy, desperate to prove her worth through motherhood. Had she ever considered that bearing children could cost her life, that the very thing she'd been denied might have been a form of protection? "Does Mr. Henderson know about my inability to have children?" "He knows," Margaret confirmed. "That's why he's willing to take you on. He needs help with his household, not another wife who might die trying to give him more children." The practical nature of the arrangement felt both insulting and oddly comforting. At least James Henderson wouldn't expect things from her that she couldn't provide. There would be no monthly disappointments, no whispered consultations with doctors, no growing resentment as years passed without the patter of small feet. Catherine spent her last night in her childhood home, lying awake, listening to familiar sounds she would never hear again. The old house creaked in predictable patterns, wind whistled through gaps in the window frames, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called to its mate through the darkness. She thought about the children she would meet tomorrow, wondered what kind of father James Henderson might be, and tried to imagine herself in yet another role where her value would be measured by her usefulness rather than her inherent worth as a person. Dawn arrived grey and cold, with frost painting delicate patterns on the windows. Catherine, dressed in her best blue dress, pinned her dark hair into a neat bun and carried her bag downstairs to where her parents waited with forced smiles and awkward embraces. The sound of wagon wheels on frozen ground announced James Henderson's arrival precisely at sunrise. Catherine watched through the kitchen window as a tall man in a brown coat climbed down from a sturdy wagon pulled by two healthy horses. His movements were economical and purposeful, suggesting someone accustomed to managing multiple responsibilities. Without wasted effort, Charles opened the door before Henderson could knock, extending his hand in greeting. "Mr. Henderson, punctual as promised. Catherine is ready to depart." James Henderson removed his hat, revealing thick brown hair and serious blue eyes that seemed older than his 35 years. When his gaze found Catherine, she was surprised by the kindness she saw there, mixed with a weariness that suggested he understood something about carrying burdens too heavy for one person alone. "Miss Dalton," he said, his voice gentle but formal, "I appreciate your willingness to help my family during this difficult time. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. Catherine found herself studying his face, searching for signs of judgment or pity. Instead, she saw quiet respect and something that might have been gratitude. When was the last time someone had looked at her as though her presence might be a gift rather than a burden? "Mr. Henderson," she replied, managing to keep her voice steady, "I hope I can be of service to your children." He nodded thoughtfully. "They're good children, but they've had to grow up faster than any child should. Your experience managing a household will be invaluable." As James Henderson loaded her bag into the wagon, Catherine hugged her parents goodbye with the strange sensation that she was embracing people she barely knew. The intimacy of family had dissolved under the weight of disappointment and practical necessity. "Write to us," Margaret whispered, though her tone suggested she didn't expect frequent correspondence. Catherine climbed into the wagon beside James Henderson, pulling her wool cloak tight against the morning chill. As they drove away from the only home she'd ever known, she watched the familiar farmhouse grow smaller until it disappeared behind a grove of bare oak trees. "Tell me about your children," she said, as they settled into the rhythm of travel, partly from genuine curiosity and partly to fill the awkward silence between strangers. James's expression softened immediately. "Michael thinks he's the man of the house now and carries responsibility that should belong to me. Sarah tries to mother the twins while maintaining her own studies. David and Daniel are typical 9-year-olds, full of energy and mischief, but they've become quieter since losing their mother." Catherine heard love and worry in his voice, the complicated emotions of a parent trying to hold a grieving family together while managing his own loss. "It must be difficult," she said carefully, "balancing work with caring for 4 children. The lumber mill requires long hours, especially now that we're filling orders for spring construction projects. I leave before dawn and return after dark. Most days, leaving the children to manage themselves far too often." The admission seemed to cost him something, as though acknowledging his limitations felt like confessing failure. Catherine recognized the feeling intimately. "Children are more resilient than adults often realize," she offered, "and taking care of each other probably helps them process their grief." James glanced at her with surprise, as if he hadn't expected such insight from someone being hired primarily for domestic skills. "You sound like you speak from experience." Catherine considered how much to reveal about her own losses. "I've learned that people can survive situations that seem impossible from the outside. Sometimes surviving makes you stronger, even when it doesn't feel that way." They traveled in comfortable silence for several miles, the wagon wheels creating a steady rhythm on the dirt road. Catherine found herself relaxing slightly as James Henderson's presence proved less intimidating than she'd feared. He seemed like a man who understood hardship without becoming bitter, someone who carried responsibility with quiet dignity. "Miss Dalton," he said eventually, "I want you to know that my expectations are simple. Help my children maintain their studies, ensure they eat proper meals, and provide the kind of feminine guidance they've been missing. Beyond that, I hope you'll feel comfortable making this arrangement work for everyone involved." The word arrangement could have sounded cold, but in James Henderson's voice it carried respect for boundaries and realistic expectations. Catherine felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. "What did you tell the children about my incoming?" she asked. "That we've hired someone to help manage the household, and that you're someone who understands what it's like to face difficult circumstances with courage." Catherine's eyes widened. "You told them about my situation? Told them that you're a strong woman who has faced challenges and chosen to help others rather than become bitter. I believe children deserve honest explanations appropriate to their understanding." The approach impressed Catherine more than flowery compliments or false reassurances could have. James Henderson seemed to be a man who treated even children as intelligent individuals deserving of truth and respect. As they approached Grand Rapids, the landscape changed from open farmland to clusters of houses surrounded by the evidence of growing industry. Smoke rose from various mills and workshops, and the roads showed more traffic as people moved between commercial establishments. "The house is just beyond town," James explained. "Close enough to civilization for conveniences, far enough out for privacy and space for the children to explore safely." Catherine found herself curious about what kind of home James Henderson had built for his family. The wagon turned onto a tree-lined lane that led to a two-story white house with green shutters and a wraparound porch that suggested both comfort and prosperity. "It's beautiful," Catherine said, meaning it sincerely. "My wife designed it," James replied, a note of remembered love in his voice. "She wanted our children to have room to grow and space to dream." As the wagon stopped in front of the house, 4 faces appeared at various windows, watching their father return with the stranger who would change their daily lives. Catherine felt her stomach flutter with nervousness as she prepared to meet the children who might become her purpose for the next 6 months. The front door opened, and a tall boy with his father's brown hair stepped onto the porch, followed by a girl with serious grey eyes and 2 identical boys whose faces showed curiosity mixed with caution. Catherine climbed down from the wagon, smoothed her skirts, and walked toward the 4 children who would determine whether this new chapter of her life held promise or merely provided another form of exile from the world that had rejected her. "Children," James said, his voice carrying the gentle authority of a loving father, "I'd like you to meet Miss Catherine Dalton, who will be helping our family for the next several months." As Catherine looked into 4 young faces marked by loss but not yet hardened by cynicism, she felt something unexpected stir in her heart. For the first time in years, she stood before people who didn't know about her failures, her divorce, or her inability to fulfill society's expectations for women. Here, she might discover whether the woman she used to be still existed beneath the layers of shame and rejection that had accumulated like dust on a forgotten piece of furniture. "Hello," she said simply, her voice carrying more hope than she'd felt in longer than she could remember. What she didn't know was that these 4 children were about to teach her lessons about family, worth, and belonging that would transform not just their daily routines, but the very foundation of who she believed herself to be. The Henderson household operated with the peculiar efficiency of children who had learned to parent themselves out of necessity. Catherine discovered this within her first hour inside the White House with green shutters, as she watched 12-year-old Sarah orchestrate breakfast preparations while simultaneously checking 9-year-old David's arithmetic homework and reminding her twin brother Daniel to wash his face properly. "Michael's already left for the mill," Sarah explained, stirring oatmeal with practiced movements. "He helps Papa with the books before school starts, then attends classes until 3 o'clock. Catherine observed the morning routine with growing amazement. These children had created their own system for survival, complete with assigned responsibilities and unspoken protocols that kept their world functioning despite the absence of parental supervision for most of each day. "Where do you attend school?" Catherine asked, accepting a cup of coffee that tasted surprisingly good for something prepared by someone barely into adolescence. "The schoolhouse is 2 miles toward town," Sarah replied. "Daniel and David walk together, and I usually catch up with the Pemberton girls who live on the next farm over." The casual mention of a 2-mile walk through Michigan countryside struck Catherine as both admirable and concerning. At 12 years old, Sarah possessed more independence than Catherine had achieved at 18, but she also carried responsibilities that should have belonged to adults. "Miss Dalton," David said suddenly, his face smeared with oatmeal and curiosity. "Papa said you came here because you needed a place to live. Are you sad like we were when Mama died?" The innocent question pierced through Catherine's careful composure. She looked into David's earnest brown eyes and realized that these children understood loss in ways that made her own situation seem less tragic by comparison. "I am sad about some things that happened to me," she admitted carefully. "But I'm also hopeful about being here with your family." Daniel, who had been silently observing this exchange, spoke up with typical 9-year-old directness. "Papa says you're going to help us keep the house better. Does that mean you know how to make real biscuits instead of the hard ones Sarah burns?" "Daniel!" Sarah protested, her cheeks flushing pink. "My biscuits aren't that bad." Catherine found herself smiling genuinely for the first time in months. "We do know how to make biscuits. Perhaps Sarah and I could work together to perfect the recipe." The suggestion sparked something bright in Sarah's grey eyes. "Would you teach me? I've been trying to follow Mama's recipes, but some of the measurements don't make sense." "I'd be happy to help," Catherine replied, then paused as understanding dawned. "Sarah, have you been managing all the cooking and household tasks since your mother passed?" The 12-year-old nodded with matter-of-fact acceptance. Someone had to do it. Papa works such long hours at the mill, and Michael helps him with business matters. The twins can set the table and gather eggs, but they're too young for cooking or washing clothes. Catherine felt her heart contract with admiration and concern. This child had stepped into an adult role without complaint or self-pity, simply because circumstances demanded it. Yet the shadows under her eyes and the careful way she moved suggested the weight of responsibility had taken its toll. "Well," Catherine said, rolling up her sleeves, "today we start sharing those responsibilities. Who wants to learn how to make proper biscuits that don't bounce when you drop them?" The resulting laughter filled the kitchen with warmth that the house had apparently been missing for months. Catherine found herself remembering what it felt like to be useful in ways that brought joy rather than merely completing necessary tasks. As the morning progressed, Catherine discovered that the Henderson children possessed remarkable intelligence and creativity despite their unconventional upbringing. David showed an intuitive understanding of mathematics that impressed her, while Daniel demonstrated an artistic talent, evident in the detailed drawings he'd made of local birds and wildflowers. "These sketches are extraordinary," Catherine told him, examining a particularly detailed rendering of a cardinal. "Have you had any formal art instruction?" Daniel shook his head shyly. "I just like drawing things I see. Mama used to say I noticed details other people missed." The mention of their mother created a moment of reverent silence. Catherine was beginning to understand that Elizabeth Henderson's memory lived actively in this household, referenced naturally and lovingly rather than avoided out of grief. "Your mother sounds like she was very wise," Catherine said gently. Noticing details is a gift that can serve you well in whatever you choose to do with your life. When the younger children departed for school, Catherine found herself alone with Sarah for the first time. The 12-year-old moved through cleaning tasks with mechanical efficiency, but Catherine noticed the slight tremor in her hands and the way she paused occasionally as if gathering strength for the next chore. "Sarah," Catherine said carefully, "how long has it been since you had time to simply be 12 years old?" The question seemed to confuse the girl. "What do you mean? When did you last play with dolls, or read a book for pleasure, or spend an afternoon doing something purely for fun?" Sarah's brow furrowed as she considered this. "I don't remember. There's always been too much work to do." Catherine felt a surge of protective instinct that surprised her with its intensity. This child had sacrificed her childhood to keep her family functioning, displaying strength and selflessness that rivaled any adults. "What if we finished the necessary work together quickly and then spent some time on activities you enjoy?" Catherine suggested. "Are there books you've wanted to read, projects you've thought about but never had time to attempt?" For the first time since Catherine's arrival, Sarah's carefully controlled expression cracked, revealing the young girl beneath the premature responsibility. "I used to love reading Mama's poetry books," she admitted, "but I haven't opened them since she died, because they made me too sad. Perhaps now that some time has passed, they might bring comfort instead of only sadness," Catherine suggested. "Would you like to try reading them together?" The idea seemed both appealing and frightening to Sarah. "What if I cry?" "Then we'll cry together," Catherine replied simply. "Sometimes tears help heal wounds that staying strong keeps open." That afternoon, when the twins returned from school with grass stains on their knees and excitement about a spelling bee victory, they found Catherine and Sarah sitting in the parlor with tea and cookies, taking turns reading aloud from a volume of Elizabeth Dickinson's poetry. "Miss Dalton," David announced, "our teacher, Mrs. Morrison, wants to meet you. She said any woman brave enough to take on 4 Henderson children must be remarkable." Catherine laughed at the backhanded compliment. "I'll be happy to meet Mrs. Morrison. Perhaps tomorrow I could walk with you to school and introduce myself." "Would you really?" Daniel asked, his eyes lighting up. "None of us have had a grown-up come to school with us since Mama died." The casual mention revealed another layer of what these children had lost. They had been managing not just household responsibilities, but also navigating school and social situations without adult guidance or advocacy. When James Henderson returned from the lumber mill that evening, he found his house transformed in ways both visible and intangible. The dinner table held a meal more elaborate than anything his children had managed alone, but more importantly, the atmosphere felt lighter, as though some invisible burden had been lifted. "Papa," Sarah said as they gathered around the table, "Miss Dalton taught me how to make biscuits that actually taste good, and she's going to help me read Mama's poetry books." Michael, who had been quiet during most of the meal, looked up from his plate. "And she knows about keeping business accounts. I mentioned the ledger problems we've been having at the mill, and she suggested a different organizational system that might work better." James's eyebrows rose with interest. "You have experience with business accounts?" Catherine nodded, feeling suddenly self-conscious. "My father's farm required detailed record-keeping, and I helped manage the books for several years. I also assisted my former husband with his grain trading business before—" She trailed off, reluctant to mention the divorce that had ended her previous life. "Before you came to help us," James finished diplomatically, sparing her the need to explain painful history. "I'd welcome any suggestions you might have. Managing both the mill operations and family responsibilities has been challenging." FICU admission revealed a vulnerability that James Henderson rarely allowed others to see. Catherine recognized the weight of trying to be everything to everyone while feeling inadequate in multiple areas simultaneously. "I'd be happy to look at the accounts," she offered. "Sometimes a fresh perspective can identify solutions that aren't obvious when you're too close to the problems." As dinner conversation flowed around the table, Catherine marveled at the intelligence and humor of these children who had faced tragedy with remarkable resilience. They teased each other with the casual affection of siblings, included her in their discussions as though she'd always been part of their family, and showed respect for their father that spoke well of his parenting despite the challenges he faced. "Miss Dalton," Daniel said as they cleared the dinner dishes, "tomorrow is Saturday. Could you come see our secret fort in the woods? We built it ourselves, but we haven't shown any grown-ups yet." "I'd be honored to see your fort," Catherine replied, touched by the invitation into their private world. That night, as Catherine settled into the comfortable bedroom James had prepared for her, she reflected on the unexpected turn her life had taken. For months, she had felt like a burden being shuffled between reluctant caretakers. Here, she was beginning to feel useful in ways that extended beyond mere domestic labor. The Henderson children needed more than someone to cook their meals and wash their clothes. They needed an adult who could recognize their individual talents, support their emotional healing, and help them navigate the complex transition from childhood to adulthood while preserving the loving family bonds their parents had created. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Sarah stood in the doorway wearing a white nightgown, her long hair braided for sleep. "Miss Dalton," the 12-year-old said hesitantly, "I wanted to thank you for today. It's been a long time since our house felt like home, instead of just the place where we sleep and eat." Catherine's throat tightened with emotion. "Thank you for welcoming me, Sarah. I haven't felt like I belonged anywhere for quite some time." "Well, you belong here now," Sarah declared, with the confident authority of someone who had learned to make adult decisions. "We all decided at dinner you fit." After Sarah returned to her room, Catherine sat by her window, looking out at the moonlit landscape that was beginning to feel familiar rather than foreign. For the first time since her parents had arranged this placement, she allowed herself to hope that the next 6 months might offer more than mere survival. The Henderson family had opened their home to her out of practical necessity, but they were offering something far more valuable than employment. They were giving her the opportunity to discover whether the woman she used to be still existed beneath the layers of shame and rejection that had accumulated over years of feeling unwanted. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and deeper insights into the complex dynamics of this household. But tonight, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced in longer than she could remember. The peace that comes from being exactly where you're supposed to be. Outside her window, an owl called through the darkness, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the gentle sound of wind moving through the trees that surrounded this house, where 4 remarkable children were learning to trust again, and where a woman who had forgotten her own worth was beginning to remember what it felt like to be valued for who she was rather than what she could produce. The morning would reveal whether this fragile beginning could develop into something stronger, but for now, Catherine allowed herself to rest in the unfamiliar comfort of belonging to a place where her presence made things better rather than more complicated. 3 weeks into Catherine's residence at the Henderson household, the carefully constructed harmony began to face its first serious challenge. The trouble arrived in the form of Mrs. Agatha Worthington, the self-appointed moral guardian of Grand Rapids society, who appeared at the front door on a crisp October morning with the determined expression of someone prepared to correct improper behavior. Catherine was in the kitchen, teaching Daniel how to measure flour for bread when the sharp rap of knuckles against wood echoed through the house. Through the window, she glimpsed a severe-looking woman in expensive black clothing stepping down from an ornate carriage, her posture radiating disapproval before she'd even crossed the threshold. "Children," Catherine said quietly, "why don't you continue with the bread recipe while I answer the door?" Sarah appeared from the parlor where she'd been practicing piano, her face clouding with recognition. "That's Mrs. Worthington," she whispered. "She's never visited us before, but she's the lady who decides what's proper for families in town." The warning sent cold dread through Catherine's stomach. She smoothed her apron, checked that her hair remained neatly pinned, and opened the door with what she hoped was a welcoming smile. "Good morning," Catherine said politely. "I'm Catherine Dalton. How may I help you?" Mrs. Worthington's sharp grey eyes swept over Catherine from head to toe, taking inventory of every detail, from her simple brown dress to her flour-dusted hands. "Miss Dalton, I am Mrs. Agatha Worthington, president of the Grand Rapids Ladies' Moral Society. I've come to discuss the irregular situation that has developed in this household." Catherine's heart began beating faster, but she maintained her composure. "Please come in. Would you care for tea?" "This is not a social call," Mrs. Worthington replied curtly, stepping into the front hallway, but declining to move further into the house. "I've heard disturbing reports about the arrangements Mr. Henderson has made regarding his children's care." From the kitchen came the sound of muffled whispers as the children undoubtedly strained to overhear the conversation that would determine their family's immediate future. Catherine was acutely aware that her response could affect not just her own situation, but the stability these children had finally begun to reclaim. "I'm not sure what reports you've heard," Catherine said carefully, "but I can assure you that the children are well cared for and properly supervised." Mrs. Worthington's expression grew more severe. A young, unmarried woman, living in the same household as a widowed man, sharing meals and daily domestic responsibilities. "Surely you understand how such an arrangement appears to decent people." The accusation hit Catherine like a physical blow, bringing back every whispered judgment and sideways glance she'd endured during her marriage's public dissolution. For a moment she felt herself shrinking back into the shameful woman who had accepted society's verdict about her worthlessness. But then she heard Sarah's voice from the kitchen, patiently helping Daniel measure ingredients, and remembered the pride in David's eyes when she'd praised his arithmetic homework. These children needed her, and more importantly, they valued her presence in ways that had nothing to do with gossip or social conventions. "Mrs. Worthington," Catherine said, her voice growing stronger, "I understand your concern for propriety, but my arrangement with Mr. Henderson is purely professional. I provide household management and childcare services in exchange for room and board. Professional arrangements require proper supervision and community oversight," Mrs. Worthington countered. "What safeguards exist to ensure appropriate behavior? What references can you provide regarding your moral character?" The question struck at Catherine's most vulnerable point. Her divorce had destroyed her reputation in her previous community, leaving her with no respectable references to offer. Mrs. Worthington seemed to sense this weakness, pressing her advantage. With the calculated cruelty of someone accustomed to wielding social power, "I've made inquiries about your background, Miss Dalton," she continued. "Your previous marriage ended in divorce under circumstances that reflect poorly on your character as a woman. Mr. Henderson may not be aware of these facts when he invited you into his children's lives." Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks. But before she could respond, a clear young voice cut through the tension. "Mrs. Worthington," Sarah said, appearing in the doorway with flour on her hands and fire in her grey eyes, "Miss Dalton has been nothing but kind and proper since she arrived. She's helped us become a real family again." The 12-year-old's fierce loyalty gave Catherine strength she hadn't known she possessed. Here was a child who understood her worth based on daily observation rather than distant gossip and social prejudice. "Child, adults are speaking," Mrs. Worthington said dismissively. "You couldn't possibly understand the complexities of proper household management. "I understand that Miss Dalton taught me how to read poetry again without crying," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her youth. "I understand that my brothers are happier than they've been since Mama died. And I understand that our house feels like home again instead of just a sad, empty place." Mrs. Worthington's face reddened with indignation. "Young lady, you have clearly been allowed far too much freedom of expression. Proper children do not contradict their elders or involve themselves in adult conversations." "Perhaps," came James, Henderson's voice from the front door, "you could explain what gives you the authority to correct my children in their own home." Catherine turned to see James standing in the doorway, his work clothes dusty from the lumber mill, but his presence commanding immediate respect. His blue eyes held a coldness she'd never seen before, directed entirely at the unwelcome visitor who had disturbed his family's peace. "Mr. Henderson," Mrs. Worthington said, attempting to regain control of the situation, "I've come as a concerned member of our community to discuss the improper arrangements you've made for your household." James stepped fully into the hallway, his height and solid build making Mrs. Worthington appear smaller and less intimidating by comparison. "And what exactly do you find improper about ensuring my children receive proper care and supervision? The moral implications of housing an unmarried woman of questionable reputation should be obvious to any respectable man," Mrs. Worthington replied. "The influence on your children's development could be permanently damaging." Catherine watched James's jaw tighten with controlled anger. She realized that this confrontation could damage his standing in the business community if not handled carefully. The lumber mill depended on local customers and community relationships. "Mrs. Worthington," Catherine said quickly, "perhaps I should look for alternative arrangements that would be more acceptable to community standards." The suggestion seemed to deflate some of James's anger, but his voice remained firm when he responded. "Miss Dalton, you'll do no such thing. My children's welfare is my responsibility, not Mrs. Worthington's or anyone else's." From the kitchen came the sound of footsteps as Michael returned from school, followed by the twins' voices as they completed their afternoon walk from the schoolhouse. The timing couldn't have been worse, bringing all 4 children home to witness this challenge to their family's stability. "Papa," Michael said, appearing in the hallway and immediately sensing the tension. "Is everything all right?" Mrs. Worthington seized on the teenager's arrival. "Young man, surely you can see how inappropriate it is for an unmarried woman to live in your family home. What kind of example does this set for your younger siblings?" Michael, at 15, possessed enough maturity to understand the implications of the question. Catherine held her breath, knowing that his response could either support or undermine everything she'd tried to build with this family. "Ma'am," Michael said with careful politeness, "Miss Dalton has been a blessing to our family. She's helped us maintain the kind of home our mother would want us to have." David and Daniel appeared in the kitchen doorway, their faces reflecting confusion about why a stranger was making their family feel upset and defensive. "Miss Dalton," Daniel said, apparently oblivious to the adult tensions, "did you see the drawing I made of the blue jay? I added all the details you suggested." The innocent interruption highlighted the absurdity of questioning Catherine's influence on children who were clearly thriving under her care. Mrs. Worthington's expression grew more pinched as she realized her accusations weren't finding support from the supposed victims of improper arrangements. "Mr. Henderson," she said, making one final attempt to assert authority, "I represent the moral standards of this community. If you continue with this unseemly arrangement, there will be consequences for your family's reputation and your business. Relationships?" The threat hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Catherine understood that Mrs. Worthington possessed the social influence to make good on her warning, potentially damaging James's lumber mill and isolating his children from community activities. "Mrs. Worthington," James said, his voice deadly. "Quiet. Let me be perfectly clear. My family's arrangements are not subject to your approval or anyone else's. If you have concerns about my children's welfare, you're welcome to observe their health, happiness, and academic progress. If you have concerns about my business practices, you're welcome to examine my accounts and customer satisfaction." He paused, allowing his words to settle before delivering his final statement. "However, if you continue to harass my family or spread gossip designed to damage our reputation, you'll discover that my patience has limits. Good day, Mrs. Worthington." The dismissal was unmistakable and final. Mrs. Worthington's face cycled through several shades of red before settling on a dangerous purple that suggested this confrontation was far from over. "Mr. Henderson, you're making a grave mistake," she said, gathering her skirts with offended dignity. "Decent families in this community will not tolerate such disregard for proper moral standards." After Mrs. Worthington's carriage disappeared down the lane, the Henderson family gathered in the kitchen like survivors of a sudden storm. Catherine felt simultaneously grateful for their support and guilty about bringing this trouble into their peaceful home. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never intended to cause problems for your family." "You didn't cause anything," Sarah said fiercely. "Mrs. Worthington is just a mean old woman who doesn't have enough to worry about in her own life." James placed a gentle hand on Catherine's shoulder. Sarah's assessment, while perhaps uncharitably expressed, is essentially accurate. Mrs. Worthington has appointed herself the guardian of everyone else's morality because her own life lacks sufficient purpose. The support felt overwhelming after months of feeling like a burden wherever she went. Catherine realized these people were willing to face social pressure to keep her as part of their family, a gesture of loyalty she'd never experienced before. "What happens now?" Michael asked, his 15-year-old mind already working through potential consequences. "Will this affect the mill's business?" James considered the question seriously. "It might. Mrs. Worthington has influence among certain social circles in Grand Rapids. But our lumber quality speaks for itself, and most of our customers care more about reliable service than social gossip." That evening, after the children had completed their homework and settled into bed, Catherine found James sitting on the front porch despite the October chill. She brought him a cup of coffee and settled into the chair beside his, both of them watching stars appear in the darkening sky. "Are you reconsidering the wisdom of keeping me here?" she asked quietly. James was silent for so long that Catherine began to fear the worst. When he finally spoke, his words surprised her. "I'm reconsidering a lot of things," he admitted, "but not whether you belong here. Today proved that my children have found something with you that they desperately needed. Sarah defended you like you were her mother. Michael spoke up for you despite potential social consequences. Even the twins see you as family." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. "And what do you see?" James turned to look at her directly, his blue eyes serious but warm. "I see a woman who's faced difficult circumstances with grace and dignity. I see someone who makes my children happier and helps them heal from their mother's death. I see a person who brings something valuable to our family that we didn't even realize we were missing." The honesty in his voice created an intimacy that both thrilled and frightened Catherine. For months, she'd been grateful for basic acceptance and practical arrangements. Now she was beginning to hope for something deeper, more permanent, more meaningful than mere employment. "Mrs. Worthington will continue causing trouble," Catherine said. "Are you prepared for what that might mean?" "I'm prepared to protect my family," James replied simply. "All of my family." The emphasis on all wasn't lost on Catherine. Somehow, without formal declarations or legal documents, she had become part of something larger than herself. The woman who had been sold by her own parents had found people willing to fight for her right to belong. As they sat in comfortable silence, Catherine realized that tomorrow would bring new challenges. Mrs. Worthington's visit had been a warning shot, not a final battle. The real test of this family's commitment to each other was still coming, but tonight, wrapped in the quiet peace of belonging somewhere important, Catherine allowed herself to believe that whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. The November blizzard struck without warning, transforming the Henderson property into an isolated fortress of snow and ice that would test every bond Catherine had formed with her new family. What began as gentle morning flakes quickly escalated into a howling tempest that buried the roads, snapped telegraph lines, and trapped everyone indoors for what would become the longest week of winter. Catherine woke to an eerie silence that seemed wrong for a Tuesday morning. The usual sounds of James preparing for work and the children getting ready for school were absent, replaced by an ominous quiet that made her skin prickle with unease. She pulled back her bedroom curtains and gasped at the wall of white that had replaced the familiar view of the front yard. Snow had drifted against the house in waves nearly 6 feet high, completely blocking the front door and most of the first-floor windows. The wind continued to shriek like a living thing, driving more snow horizontally across the landscape and making it impossible to see beyond the immediate vicinity of the house. Downstairs, she found James standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee and a grim expression. The children had gathered around him, their faces reflecting a mixture of excitement and concern as they processed the magnitude of their situation. "How bad is it?" Catherine asked, though the answer was obvious from the expressions surrounding her. "We're completely cut off," James replied. "The road to town is impassable, and even if we could dig out, this storm isn't finished. The barometer suggests we could be trapped here for days." Michael stepped forward, his 15-year-old shoulders already bearing the weight of adult responsibility. "I checked the barn this morning. The animals are secure, but we'll need to dig paths to reach them for daily care." "What about food?" Sarah asked, her practical mind immediately jumping to essential concerns. "Do we have enough supplies to last?" Catherine found herself automatically taking inventory of their resources, her mind shifting into the crisis management mode she'd learned during harsh winters on her father's farm. "Let me check the pantry and root cellar. We should also conserve firewood and organize cooking to minimize fuel consumption." The next several hours revealed the true scope of their challenge. They had sufficient food for perhaps 5 days if they rationed carefully, but heating the entire house would quickly exhaust their wood supply. Worse, the storm showed no signs of abating, and the temperature continued dropping as Arctic air settled over Michigan. "We'll need to consolidate into fewer rooms," James announced after surveying their fuel situation. "The kitchen and parlor can be kept warm if we close off the rest of the house and move the bedding downstairs." What followed was an exercise in survival that stripped away all pretense and social conventions, revealing the core character of each family member. Catherine watched Sarah organize the younger children's belongings with the efficiency of someone twice her age, while Michael worked alongside his father to secure the house against the continuing storm. "Miss Catherine," Daniel said, appearing at her elbow with a worried expression, "what if we run out of food before the storm stops?" The question pierced through Catherine's own carefully maintained calm. She knelt to his eye level, taking his small hands in hers and feeling the weight of responsibility for this child's emotional well-being. "Daniel, sometimes when situations seem scary, the best thing we can do is focus on what we can control," she said gently. "We can be careful with our food, we can help each other stay warm, and we can trust that this storm will end just like every storm before it." Her words seemed to reassure Daniel, but Catherine felt the pressure of needing to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. If this crisis tested the family's faith in her competence, she couldn't afford to show weakness or uncertainty. By evening, they had transformed the parlor into a makeshift dormitory, with mattresses and blankets arranged around the fireplace that would provide their only heat source. The intimate quarters forced them into closer contact than ever before, eliminating the polite distances that had previously defined their relationships. "Tell us a story," David requested as they settled into their unusual sleeping arrangements. "Something exciting but not scary." Catherine found herself drawing on memories of her grandmother's tales, weaving narratives about brave pioneers who faced impossible challenges through cleverness and determination. As her voice filled the firelit room, she noticed how the children's faces relaxed into the peaceful expressions of those who felt safe despite dangerous circumstances. "You have a gift for storytelling," James said quietly, when the children had finally fallen asleep. They needed something to focus on besides our situation. Sitting so close to him in the dim light, Catherine became acutely aware of James as a man rather than simply an employer. The crisis had revealed his steady strength and protective instincts, qualities that made her feel cherished in ways she'd never experienced with her former husband. "I learned from my grandmother," she replied softly. She believed that stories could provide hope when reality became too difficult to bear. The second day brought new challenges as their food supplies dwindled faster than anticipated, and the cold began seeping through even their carefully sealed refuge. David developed a fever that sent panic through Catherine's heart, while Daniel grew listless in ways that suggested the beginning stages of illness. "We need to get the boys to a doctor," Sarah said, her young face tight with worry. "The roads are still impassable," James replied, though Catherine could see the fear in his eyes. "Even if we could reach town, Dr. Harrison might not be able to travel in these conditions." Catherine felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders. During her years managing her father's farm, she had learned basic medical care out of necessity, but treating sick children carried responsibilities that terrified her. "I have some experience with fever and respiratory ailments," she said carefully. "My grandmother taught me herbal remedies that might help until we can reach proper medical care." The admission created a moment of profound trust as James and Sarah looked to her for guidance that could literally mean life or death for the two youngest Henderson children. Catherine realized that this crisis would define her place in the family more than months of daily routines ever could. She began by moving David and Daniel closer to the fire, then prepared hot compresses and herbal teas from the dried plants she'd noticed in Elizabeth Henderson's abandoned garden. As she worked, explaining each treatment to Sarah and demonstrating proper care techniques, Catherine felt something shift in the family dynamics. "You really do know what you're doing," Michael observed, watching her check David's breathing and pulse with practiced competence. "I pray I do," Catherine replied honestly. "Sometimes knowledge feels insufficient when lives depend on your decisions." The third day tested everyone's endurance as the storm continued with unrelenting fury, while both younger boys grew sicker despite Catherine's treatments. Sarah worked beside her with unwavering dedication, learning advanced nursing skills that no 12-year-old should need to master. "What if they don't get better?" Sarah whispered during a moment when the boys were sleeping and James had gone to check on the livestock. Catherine looked at this brave child who had already endured the loss of her mother and now faced the possibility of losing her brothers. The question demanded honesty rather than false reassurance. "Then we'll have done everything humanly possible to help them," Catherine said. "Sometimes that has to be enough, even when it doesn't feel sufficient." The answer seemed to give Sarah strength rather than discouragement. Catherine realized that treating children like intelligent beings capable of handling difficult truths often served them better than attempted protection through deception. By the fourth day, Catherine's treatments began showing results as David's fever broke and Daniel's appetite returned. The improvement created a surge of relief and gratitude that bonded the family more tightly than any formal ceremony could have accomplished. "You saved them," James said simply, finding Catherine in the kitchen as she prepared a more substantial meal for the recovering boys. "We all saved them," Catherine corrected. "Sarah's nursing care was crucial, Michael's help with practical matters kept everything functioning, and your calm leadership prevented panic that could have made everything worse." James stepped closer, his blue eyes intense with emotions that made Catherine's heart race. "Catherine, what I'm about to say might be premature, but this crisis has shown me something important." She held her breath, sensing that whatever came next would change everything between them. "I've watched you care for my children as though they were your own," he continued. "You've shown wisdom, courage, and devotion that goes far beyond any employment arrangement. My children need you, but more than that, I need you." The admission hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Catherine felt years of self-doubt and rejection warring with the growing love she tried to keep carefully controlled. "James," she said softly, "I need to tell you something about my past that might change how you feel. Nothing about your past could change what I've witnessed with my own eyes," he replied firmly. "You are the woman I've come to know, not whatever circumstances brought you to us." Before Catherine could respond, the sound of voices outside interrupted their moment. Through the frost-covered window, they could see men with shovels working. "To clear a path to the house, neighbors," James said with mixed relief and regret. "The storm must be breaking." The rescue party consisted of 5 men from nearby farms who had banded together to check on isolated families once the worst of the blizzard passed. Among them was Dr. Harrison, who had made the difficult journey specifically to examine the Henderson children after receiving word about their illness. "Thank goodness you're all safe," Dr. Harrison said, stamping snow from his boots as he entered the warm kitchen. "We were concerned when no one had seen smoke from your chimney for 2 days." After examining David and Daniel, the doctor confirmed that Catherine's treatments had been not just adequate, but potentially life-saving. "Your herbal remedies and nursing care prevented these fevers from developing into pneumonia," he told her privately. "Where did you learn such advanced medical techniques?" "My grandmother was a midwife and healer in our community," Catherine explained. "She taught me that sometimes remote locations require people to possess skills beyond their usual roles." Dr. Harrison nodded with professional respect. "You should consider formal medical training. You have natural instincts and practical knowledge that would serve any community well." The suggestion planted a seed in Catherine's mind about possibilities she'd never considered. Perhaps her worth extended beyond domestic skills into areas where her intelligence and compassion could serve larger purposes. As the men prepared to leave, having ensured the Henderson family's immediate safety, James pulled their leader aside for a quiet conversation Catherine couldn't overhear. Whatever he said seemed to satisfy the neighbors, who departed with respectful nods in her direction. That evening, as the family settled back into their normal sleeping arrangements with the crisis past, Catherine reflected on how profoundly the week had changed her relationship with each Henderson family member. She had proven herself capable of protecting and nurturing them through genuine danger, while they had demonstrated loyalty and trust that exceeded mere gratitude. "Miss Catherine," Daniel said as she tucked him into his own bed for the first time in days, "when I was sick, I dreamed that you were my real mama. Was that wrong?" The innocent question brought tears to Catherine's eyes. "Dreams like that aren't wrong, Daniel. They're your heart telling you about the love that's growing between all of us." Later, as Catherine prepared for bed in her own room, she found a note that Sarah had slipped under her door. Written in the 12-year-old's careful script were words that would stay with Catherine forever. "Dear Miss Catherine, thank you for saving David and Daniel and for making us feel like a real family again. I know Mama would be happy that we found someone who loves us the way she did. You always belong with us. Love, Sarah. The week that had begun as a test of survival had become a crucible that forged something stronger than employment or even friendship. The Henderson family had chosen Catherine as truly as she had chosen them, creating bonds that no social convention or external pressure could easily break. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the outside world reconnected with their isolated household, but tonight, Catherine fell asleep knowing that she had found her place in the world through courage, competence, and love, rather than through the biological connections that society valued above all else. The woman who had been rejected for her inability to create life had instead saved lives, proving her worth in the most fundamental way possible. The confrontation Catherine had been dreading arrived on a deceptively peaceful December morning, delivered by a man whose very presence turned her blood to ice water. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the unmistakable voice of Robert Brennan calling her name across the frozen yard. Her former husband stood beside a hired carriage, his black wool coat and polished boots marking him as prosperous despite the divorce that had supposedly ruined his reputation. Behind him waited another man Catherine didn't recognize, though his official bearing and leather document case suggested legal authority that made her stomach clench with dread. "Catherine," Robert called out, his voice carrying the same commanding tone that had once made her flinch with automatic obedience. "Stop this foolishness and come speak with me like a civilized person." The laundry basket slipped from Catherine's numb fingers, scattering clean sheets across the snow as 23 years of conditioning warred with the strength she'd discovered during her months with the Henderson family. Part of her wanted to run, to hide in the house until these men left, but a larger part refused to cower before the man who had publicly discarded her. "Mr. Brennan," she said, her voice steadier than she'd expected, "you have no business on this property." Robert's face hardened with the familiar expression she remembered from their worst arguments. "I have every right to reclaim my lawful wife from this scandalous situation. Do you realize what people are saying about you living unmarried with a widowed man and his children?" The accusation stung because Catherine knew the gossip had spread far beyond Grand Rapids, carried by travelers and correspondents to communities throughout Michigan. Mrs. Worthington's moral crusade had apparently reached Robert's ears, providing him with ammunition for whatever scheme had brought him here. "I am not your wife," Catherine replied firmly. "You divorced me, remember? You made quite certain everyone knew you considered me defective merchandise." The man with the document case stepped forward, introducing himself with the pompous authority of someone accustomed to intimidating others through legal technicalities. "Mrs. Brennan, I am attorney Percival Blackwood. I represent your husband's interests in this matter." "My former husband," Catherine corrected, though her heart was racing as she wondered what legal complications Robert might have discovered. Attorney Blackwood opened his leather case and withdrew several official-looking papers. "There are irregularities in your divorce proceedings that may render the dissolution invalid. Michigan territorial law requires specific procedures that may not have been properly followed." The words hit Catherine like physical blows. If her divorce wasn't legally valid, she would still be married to Robert, making her current living situation not just scandalous but potentially criminal. Worse, any relationship with James Henderson could be considered adultery with serious legal consequences. "What do you want?" Catherine asked, though she already suspected the answer would be worse than anything she'd imagined. Robert stepped closer, his presence as oppressive as she remembered from their marriage. "I want you to return to your proper place as my wife. I've purchased land in Ohio where we can start fresh, away from people who know about our previous difficulties." The offer sounded reasonable on the surface, but Catherine recognized the underlying threat. Robert was offering her a chance to escape scandal by returning to a marriage that had nearly destroyed her spirit. The alternative would be facing legal challenges that could ruin not just her own reputation, but James Henderson's business and his children's standing in the community. "And if I refuse?" Catherine asked, already knowing the answer. Attorney Blackwood smiled with the cold satisfaction of someone holding winning cards. "Then we'll be forced to pursue legal remedies that could result in criminal charges against both you and Mr. Henderson for adultery and moral corruption of minors." The threat to the Henderson children made Catherine's vision blur with rage. Whatever Robert wanted to do to her was one thing, but involving innocent children in his vindictive schemes crossed every line of human decency. "You would destroy 4 children's lives to satisfy your wounded pride?" Catherine asked, her voice shaking with fury. "I would uphold the moral standards that keep society functioning properly," Robert replied sanctimoniously. "Children should not be exposed to the corrupting influence of adults who live outside legal and religious constraints." Before Catherine could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps announced James Henderson's arrival from the lumber mill. She turned to see him striding across the yard with the purposeful gait of a man prepared to defend his territory, his blue eyes already assessing the threat posed by these unwelcome visitors. "Gentlemen," James said, his voice polite but edged with warning, "you're on my property. State your business." Robert drew himself up to his full height, attempting to project authority through physical presence. "I am Robert Brennan, Catherine's lawful husband. I've come to collect my wife and remove her from this inappropriate situation." "Miss Dalton is not property to be collected," James replied, his tone growing dangerously quiet. "She's a member of my household who contributes valuable services in exchange for fair compensation." Attorney Blackwood stepped forward with his papers, apparently relishing the opportunity to deliver devastating news. "Mr. Henderson, you may not be aware that this woman's divorce may be legally invalid, making her current residence here not just improper but potentially criminal." James's expression didn't change, but Catherine saw his hands clench into fists before he forced them to relax. "What proof do you have of these claims?" "Irregularities in the original divorce proceedings," Blackwood replied smoothly. "Michigan territorial courts require specific documentation that may not have been properly filed. If Mrs. Brennan remains legally married, her cohabitation with another man constitutes adultery." The legal trap was elegant in its cruelty. Whether the claims were true or false, investigating them would require expensive legal proceedings that could bankrupt James's business and destroy his family's reputation, while the case remained unresolved. "Catherine," James said, turning to her with eyes that held both love and fear, "what do you want to do?" The question pierced through Catherine's panic and self-doubt, reminding her that she had choices even in this desperate situation. For months, Robert had controlled her life through manipulation and social pressure, but James was offering her agency in determining her own fate. "I want to stay here with people who value me for who I am, rather than what I can produce," Catherine said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I want to continue helping children who need me and building a life based on love, rather than legal obligations." Robert's face turned red with anger at her defiance. "You stupid woman, do you realize what you're throwing away? I'm offering you respectability, security, and a chance to redeem your reputation in a new community where people don't know about your failures. The only failure was believing I deserved the treatment you gave me," Catherine replied. "I've learned my worth isn't determined by your opinion or society's expectations." From the house came the sound of the kitchen door opening as the Henderson children emerged to investigate the commotion. Catherine's heart sank as she realized they would witness whatever ugly scene was about to unfold. "Papa!" Sarah called out, her 12-year-old voice carrying worry. "Is everything all right?" James turned toward his children with protective instincts that overrode every other consideration. Go back inside and continue with your afternoon lessons. I'll handle this situation. But 15-year-old Michael had already assessed the tension and moved to position himself between the strangers and his younger siblings. "These men are upsetting Miss Catherine," he said, his voice carrying the moral certainty of youth. "Maybe they should leave." Attorney Blackwood laughed condescendingly. "Young man, this is an adult matter involving legal complexities you couldn't possibly understand. I understand that good people don't threaten families or try to take away someone who belongs with us," Michael replied with dignity that made Catherine's heart swell with pride. Daniel appeared at his older brother's shoulder, his 9-year-old face serious with concern. "Miss Catherine, are these bad men trying to hurt you?" The innocent question cut through all the legal maneuvering and social posturing, reducing the situation to its essential elements. Robert and his attorney were attempting to use fear and intimidation to force Catherine into abandoning the life she'd built with people who genuinely loved her. "Daniel," Catherine said, kneeling to meet his eyes, "sometimes grown-ups have disagreements about what's right and wrong, but I want you to know that I'm not going anywhere if I can help it." The promise was both declaration and prayer, spoken. As much for her own courage as for the child's reassurance, Robert stepped toward Catherine with the aggressive posture of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. "You're coming with me today, Catherine. I won't allow my wife to continue this charade of independence." "She's not going anywhere," James said, moving to place himself between Robert and Catherine. "And if you attempt to force her, you'll discover that legal papers don't protect you from the consequences of threatening my family." The confrontation had reached a dangerous point where physical violence seemed increasingly likely. Catherine realized that whatever happened next would determine not just her own fate, but the future of everyone she'd come to love. "Mr. Brennan," she said, standing to face her former husband directly, "you divorced me because you considered me worthless. You cannot now claim I have value simply because other people have discovered what you were too blind to see." "I made a mistake," Robert admitted, his voice taking on a wheedling tone that suggested desperation beneath his bluster. "People do foolish things when they're disappointed. I'm offering you a chance to rebuild our marriage on better foundations." Catherine studied the man who had shaped so much of her pain and self-doubt, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. Robert wasn't offering reconciliation based on love or genuine remorse. He was attempting to reclaim what he perceived as his property before someone else could benefit from its value. "Mr. Brennan," she said with quiet finality, "if you ever loved me, you'll leave me in peace to build the life I've found here. If you never loved me, then you have no claim to destroy the happiness I've discovered without you." Attorney Blackwood sensed his client's weakening position and attempted to regain control through renewed legal threats. "Mrs. Brennan, your romantic sentiments cannot override legal realities. If you refuse to return with your husband voluntarily, we'll be forced to pursue remedies through the courts." "Then pursue them," James said firmly. "We'll meet any legal challenges you bring with our own attorneys and let the courts determine the truth of your claims." The calm acceptance of battle seemed to deflate some of Robert's confidence. Perhaps he had expected Catherine to crumble under pressure as she had during their marriage, or maybe he hadn't anticipated united resistance from an entire family willing to fight for her. "You're making a serious mistake, Catherine," Robert said, his tone shifting toward warning. "I'm offering you one last chance to avoid public scandal and legal consequences that could destroy everyone involved." "The only mistake would be abandoning people who've shown me what love actually looks like," Catherine replied. "I'd rather face whatever challenges come from staying than spend another day pretending to be grateful for treatment that made me feel worthless." As Robert and Attorney Blackwood prepared to leave, defeated but not surrendering, Mrs. Worthington's familiar carriage appeared at the end of the lane. The moral crusader had apparently timed her arrival to witness whatever drama unfolded, positioning herself to spread gossip about the scandal throughout Grand Rapids society. "This isn't over," Robert promised as he climbed into his hired carriage. "You'll discover that defying social conventions and legal obligations carries consequences you haven't considered." After the men departed, Catherine found herself surrounded by the Henderson family, who offered silent support simply through their presence. She realized that this confrontation had forced her to articulate truths about her worth and desires that she had barely admitted to herself. "Are you all right?" James asked, his voice gentle with concern. "I'm terrified," Catherine admitted honestly, "but I'm also certain that staying here is worth whatever we have to face." Mrs. Worthington's carriage remained at the end of the lane. For several more minutes, its occupant undoubtedly cataloguing every detail for future gossip sessions. The moral guardian's presence served as a reminder that the battle for Catherine's right to belong had only just begun. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, an unusual quiet settled over the table. Everyone understood that the confrontation with Robert had changed their situation fundamentally, transforming what had been private happiness into a public battle with uncertain outcomes. "What happens next?" Sarah asked, her practical mind already working through potential consequences. "We face whatever comes together," James replied. "This family doesn't abandon its members when circumstances become difficult." Catherine felt tears threaten as she looked around the table at these people who had chosen to stand with her, despite the social and legal storms gathering on the horizon. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as word of the confrontation spread through the community. But tonight, she was exactly where she belonged, surrounded by love that couldn't be destroyed by legal documents or social pressure. The woman who had once accepted rejection as her natural fate had finally found people willing to fight for her right to stay. The crisis that would determine Catherine's fate erupted at dawn on Christmas Eve, when young David Henderson collapsed in the barn while helping his father with morning chores. James burst through the kitchen door, carrying his unconscious son, his face white with terror, as he shouted for Catherine to fetch Dr. Harrison immediately. "He just fell over," James said, his voice breaking as he laid David on the kitchen table. One moment he was laughing about the new calf, the next he was on the ground shaking and burning with fever. Catherine's hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking David's pulse and breathing, while her mind raced through possible causes. The 9-year-old's skin felt dangerously hot, and his breathing came in shallow, rapid pants that suggested serious respiratory distress. "Sarah, ride to town for Dr. Harrison," Catherine instructed, her voice calm despite the panic clawing at her chest. "Tell him we need him immediately. Michael, help me move David to his bed and gather cold clothes. Daniel, start boiling water." As the family mobilized around the medical emergency, Catherine realized that this crisis was unfolding just as Robert Brennan's legal challenges were reaching their peak. 2 days earlier, official court documents had arrived, summoning both Catherine and James to appear before a territorial judge to answer charges of adultery and moral corruption. The timing seemed deliberately cruel, as if fate was testing whether Catherine's newfound happiness could survive simultaneous attacks on multiple fronts. She pushed such thoughts aside, focusing entirely on the child whose life might depend on her medical knowledge and quick thinking. David's condition deteriorated rapidly over the next several hours, his fever climbing to dangerous levels despite Catherine's cooling treatments. When Dr. Harrison finally arrived, his examination confirmed Catherine's worst fears. "Acute pneumonia," the doctor announced grimly. "The boy's lungs are severely inflamed, and his fever suggests widespread infection. This is extremely serious." James gripped the back of a chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. "What can we do?" Dr. Harrison's expression conveyed the gravity of David's situation. "Keep him cool, ensure he drinks fluids if he's conscious, and pray." I can leave laudanum for pain, but beyond that, we're at the mercy of his constitution and whatever nursing care you can provide." After the doctor departed, Catherine found herself essentially responsible for David's survival. The weight of that responsibility felt crushing, especially with legal proceedings looming that could separate her from this family at their moment of greatest need. "Miss Catherine," Daniel whispered, his twin brother's illness leaving him confused and frightened. "Is David going to die like Mama did?" The question pierced through Catherine's clinical focus, reminding her that David's condition was triggering traumatic memories for all the Henderson children. They had already lost their mother. Losing a sibling might destroy what remained of their sense of security. "We're going to do everything possible to help David get better," Catherine replied, pulling Daniel close. "But I need you to be very brave and help me take care of him." What followed were the longest 3 days of Catherine's life. She maintained a constant vigil beside David's bed, monitoring his breathing, adjusting cooling cloths, and coaxing small sips of herbal tea past his fever-cracked lips. Sarah helped with unwavering dedication, while Michael managed household responsibilities and Daniel provided quiet companionship. James divided his time between the lumber mill, where urgent business demanded attention, and David's bedside, where he watched his son fight for life with the helpless desperation of a parent facing circumstances beyond his control. On the second night, as David's breathing became increasingly labored, Catherine made a decision that terrified her. Her grandmother had taught her about a dangerous but potentially life-saving treatment for severe pneumonia involving steam inhalation with specific medicinal herbs. The technique could clear congested lungs, but administered incorrectly, it could also cause fatal burns or respiratory damage. "James," she said quietly, drawing him into the hallway outside David's room, "there's something I might try, but it carries significant risks." She explained the steam treatment, watching James's face cycle through hope, fear, and desperate calculation. If David continued deteriorating, he would likely die regardless of intervention. The risky treatment offered their only chance of saving him. "Do it," James said without hesitation. "I trust your judgment completely. The procedure required careful preparation and precise timing." Catherine heated water with eucalyptus, pine needles, and other respiratory herbs, creating therapeutic steam that David could inhale under carefully controlled conditions. For 30 terrifying minutes, she monitored his breathing while the medicinal vapors worked to break up the congestion in his lungs. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, David's breathing began to ease. The harsh, labored sounds softened into more natural rhythms, and his fever finally began to break as his body started winning its battle against infection. By dawn of the 3rd day, David was conscious and asking for water. His crisis passed, but his recovery was just beginning. Catherine collapsed into a chair beside his bed, emotionally and physically exhausted, but overwhelmed with relief that her medical intervention had succeeded. "You saved him," Sarah said simply, her 12-year-old face showing maturity far beyond her years. "Just like you saved the twins during the blizzard. You keep saving all of us." The observation struck Catherine with sudden clarity about her role in this family. She wasn't just providing domestic services or even emotional support. She was serving as protector and healer, using skills and knowledge that made her genuinely irreplaceable. Later that morning, as David slept peacefully and the family began returning to normal routines, an unexpected visitor arrived at the Henderson door. Attorney Marcus Whitfield, a distinguished gentleman from Detroit, introduced himself as representing Catherine's interests in the upcoming legal proceedings. "Miss Dalton," he said, settling into the parlor with documents that suggested extensive preparation, "I've been retained by concerned parties to investigate the claims made against you and Mr. Henderson." Catherine felt her stomach clench with new anxiety. Retained by whom? I haven't hired any legal representation. Attorney Whitfield smiled with professional satisfaction. Dr. Harrison contacted colleagues in Detroit after witnessing your medical incompetence during recent emergencies. The Michigan Medical Association has taken interest in your case, particularly regarding attempts to prosecute someone whose healing knowledge has saved multiple lives. The revelation stunned Catherine. She had no idea that her medical interventions had attracted attention beyond the immediate community, or that professional physicians might view her situation as worth defending. "What did you discover about the divorce proceedings?" James asked, his voice tense with anticipation. "Quite interesting irregularities," Whitfield replied, "but not the ones claimed by Mr. Brennan's attorney. The original divorce was filed properly and remains legally valid. However, Mr. Brennan committed perjury in his statements about grounds for dissolution, and his current attorney has knowingly filed false documents with territorial courts." Catherine felt her knees weaken with relief. "So, I'm not still married to Robert?" "Definitely not," Whitfield confirmed. "More importantly, the perjury and false documentation provide grounds for criminal charges against both Mr. Brennan and Attorney Blackwood. They attempted to use fraudulent legal claims to extort compliance with their demands. The legal vindication felt almost too good to believe after months of worry about potential consequences. Catherine realized that her former husband's scheme had not only failed, but had exposed him to serious legal jeopardy. "There's more," Whitfield continued. "I've also investigated the social pressure being applied by certain community members. Mrs. Worthington's campaign against your family appears motivated by financial interests rather than moral concerns." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her young mind immediately grasping the implication that their tormentor had ulterior motives. "Mrs. Worthington owns property she hoped to sell to the lumber mill for expansion," Whitfield explained. "When Mr. Henderson declined her inflated asking price, she apparently decided to damage his reputation and business prospects through moral crusades. The revelation recontextualized all of Mrs. Worthington's interference, transforming her from misguided moral guardian into calculating businesswoman using social pressure to achieve financial goals." Catherine felt a mixture of anger and relief at understanding the true motivations behind their persecution. That afternoon brought another unexpected development when a delegation of community women arrived at the Henderson house. Led by Mrs. Patterson, the mill owner's wife, the group included teachers, doctors' wives, and other respectable ladies who had been quietly observing the controversy surrounding Catherine's presence. "Miss Dalton," Mrs. Patterson said formally, "we've come to express our support for your continued residence with the Henderson family. Your medical knowledge and devotion to these children exemplify the highest ideals of Christian service." Behind her, the other women nodded agreement, their collective presence representing a significant portion of Grand Rapids' female social leadership. Catherine realized that while Mrs. Worthington had been creating public drama, other community members had been making their own assessments based on observed results rather than theoretical moral positions. "Furthermore," added Mrs. Caroline Morrison, the schoolteacher, "we understand that certain parties have made threats regarding your relationship with this family. We want you to know that any legal proceedings will face testimony from multiple witnesses regarding your exemplary character and beneficial influence on these children." The support felt overwhelming after months of feeling isolated and defensive. Catherine had focused so intently on winning acceptance from the Henderson family that she hadn't noticed gaining respect from the broader community through her actions and competence. As Christmas Eve evening approached, the Henderson family gathered around David's bed for a quiet celebration adapted to accommodate his continuing recovery. The near loss of their beloved family member had stripped away any concerns about external judgments or social pressures, leaving only gratitude. "For being together, Miss Catherine," David said weakly but clearly. "Daniel told me you saved my life. Is that true?" Catherine looked at this precious child, whose survival had required every skill her grandmother had taught her, realizing that her worth had been proven in the most fundamental way possible. "We all saved your life," she replied. "Your father's." Quick thinking, Sarah's help with nursing, Michael's management of everything else, Daniel's companionship, and the treatments I learned from my grandmother. Families save each other. "Are you really part of our family now?" David asked with the innocent directness of childhood. Before Catherine could respond, James spoke from the doorway where he'd been listening to their conversation. "Miss Catherine," he said formally, then knelt beside David's bed so they were all at the same level. "I have something important to ask, and I'd like my children to hear it." Catherine's heart began racing as she sensed what was coming. "These past months have shown me that our family is complete only when you're part of it," James continued. "You've proven yourself as healer, protector, teacher, and the heart that holds us all together. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife and making this arrangement permanent?" The proposal, delivered in front of the children who had become her world, felt like the culmination of everything she had dared to hope for during her darkest moments. Catherine looked around at 4 young faces showing excitement and anticipation, realizing that they had been part of this decision. "Yes," she said simply, her voice carrying certainty that surprised her with its strength. "Yes, I want to spend my life as part of this family." The celebration that followed was subdued due to David's condition, but filled with joy that felt deeper than any formal ceremony could provide. Catherine had found her place not through biological connection or social convention, but through proving her value during the moments that mattered most. Later that evening, as the family settled into peaceful Christmas Eve routines, Catherine reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from rejection and despair to love and belonging. The woman who had been sold by her parents as damaged goods had discovered her true worth through serving others with skills and devotion that made her irreplaceable. Tomorrow would bring official resolution to the legal challenges and social pressures that had threatened their happiness. But tonight, Catherine fell asleep knowing that she had already won the only victory that truly mattered, the right to belong somewhere she was valued for exactly who she was. 2 years later, Catherine Henderson stood in the doorway of her expanded kitchen, watching her husband James teach their newest addition to walk across the polished wooden floor. Little Elizabeth, now 18 months old and blessed with her father's determined blue eyes, took wobbling steps between James's outstretched arms and the kitchen table where Sarah was preparing Sunday dinner. The scene filled Catherine with a profound contentment she had never imagined possible during those dark months when her own parents had sold her like damaged livestock. The woman who had been told she was worthless because she couldn't bear children now watched her biological daughter take her first independent steps, surrounded by the 4 children who had claimed Catherine as their mother through choice, rather than biology. "Mama Catherine," David called from the parlor where he was helping Daniel arrange wildflowers for the dinner table. "Dr. Morrison is riding up the lane with his wife. Should I set 2 more places?" At 11 years old, David showed no lasting effects from the pneumonia that had nearly claimed his life 2 Christmases ago. His easy use of Mama Catherine reflected the family's solution to honoring both their lost mother's memory and Catherine's vital place in their present lives. "Of course," Catherine replied, smoothing her blue Sunday dress as she prepared to welcome guests who had become dear friends since her marriage to James. "And ask Michael to bring more chairs from the dining room." Dr. Morrison's visits had become regular occurrences since Catherine had begun assisting him with particularly difficult medical cases throughout the county. Her exceptional skills with herbal remedies and emergency treatments had earned respect throughout Michigan's medical community, leading to informal consultations that supplemented the family's income while serving neighbors in need. Mrs. Henderson, Dr. Morrison said warmly as he entered the kitchen with his wife Margaret, "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I have news that couldn't wait until our scheduled meeting tomorrow." Catherine accepted Margaret's embrace while wondering what development could prompt such urgency. Over the past year, Dr. Morrison had been advocating for formal medical education programs that would allow women with natural healing abilities to receive professional training and certification. "The Michigan Medical Board has approved our proposal," Dr. Morrison announced, his face glowing with excitement. Beginning this fall, qualified women will be admitted to a specialized medical training program in Detroit. "Catherine, they want you to be among the first students." The news struck Catherine speechless. For months, Dr. Morrison had hinted about possibilities for expanding her medical role, but she had never dared hope for formal recognition of her abilities or opportunities. "For advanced education, medical school?" Sarah asked, her 17-year-old face showing pride mixed with concern. "Would that mean Mama Catherine would have to leave us?" James stepped forward, baby Elizabeth balanced on his hip, his expression revealing that this conversation had been anticipated and discussed privately between the adults. "The program allows students to complete much of their coursework through correspondence and practical apprenticeships," James explained. "Catherine could train with Dr. Morrison here while traveling to Detroit only for examinations and specialized instruction." Catherine felt her heart racing with possibility and uncertainty. The offer represented validation beyond anything she had imagined when her medical interventions had saved David's life, but it also suggested responsibilities that might conflict with her role as wife and mother to 6 children. "What would this mean for our family?" she asked carefully, looking around at faces that had become more precious to her than her own life. "It means," said 16-year-old Michael with the wisdom of someone who had matured quickly through necessity, "that our mother would become the first licensed female physician in this part of Michigan. It means other families wouldn't have to fear losing children to illnesses you could treat." The teenager's perspective struck Catherine with sudden clarity about the broader implications of Dr. Morrison's offer. Her medical knowledge, gained through necessity and refined through crisis, could serve purposes far beyond her own family's needs. "Mama Catherine," Daniel said, now 11 and showing artistic talents that suggested a future in illustration or design, "remember when you told me that broken things can become useful in new ways? Maybe your broken marriage led you to healing skills that can help lots of people." The observation demonstrated an emotional intelligence that never ceased to amaze Catherine. These children, who had faced loss and disruption with remarkable resilience, understood concepts about growth through adversity that many adults never grasped. Margaret Morrison leaned forward with the enthusiasm of someone personally invested in the program's success. "Catherine, this opportunity could change how society views women's capabilities in medicine. Your combination of natural ability, practical experience, and formal education would make you uniquely qualified to bridge traditional healing practices with modern medical science." As Sunday dinner progressed around the extended table that accommodated the Morrison family, neighbors who had stopped by, and the 6 Henderson children, Catherine found herself at the center of animated discussions about her potential medical career. The conversation revealed how dramatically her reputation had evolved from suspected moral liability to community treasure. "Mrs. Worthington still spreads occasional gossip," admitted Mrs. Patterson, who had become one of Catherine's closest friends. "But most people remember how you saved the Miller baby during that difficult birth last spring. Actions speak louder than whispered judgments." The mention of Mrs. Worthington brought smiles rather than anxiety now. The former moral crusader had been forced to sell her property at a significant loss after her financial manipulations became public knowledge. She remained in Grand Rapids but wielded considerably less social influence after her true motivations were exposed. "What happened to Mr. Brennan and his attorney?" asked Sarah, who had developed a keen interest in justice and legal matters since witnessing Catherine's vindication. Both faced criminal charges for perjury and filing false documents, Dr. Morrison replied. Mr. Brennan paid substantial fines and legal costs, while Attorney Blackwood lost his license to practice law in Michigan. Their scheme backfired spectacularly. Catherine felt no satisfaction in her former husband's downfall, only relief that his attempts to reclaim control over her life had ended in complete failure. Robert's defeat had been absolute, leaving her free to build the future she had chosen, without fear of legal interference. As evening approached and guests departed, the Henderson family settled into their customary Sunday routine of reading, music, and quiet conversation. James played his harmonica while the children took turns sharing highlights from their week, a tradition that kept them connected despite increasingly busy individual schedules. "Mama Catherine," David said during a pause in the music, "will you really become a doctor?" Catherine looked around at her family, these people who had given her purpose and love when she believed herself worthless, realizing that her answer would affect not just her own future, but their understanding of what was possible for women in their changing world. "I think I will," she said slowly, testing the words as she spoke them, "but not because I want to leave this family, or because caring for you isn't important enough, because the skills that help me take care of you could also help me take care of other families who need medical assistance." Little Elizabeth chose that moment to take 3 steps from her father's arms directly to Catherine, collapsing into her mother's lap with the triumphant giggle of someone who had achieved an important goal. The timing seemed symbolic of progress and new beginnings. "Besides," Catherine added, cuddling her youngest daughter, "this family taught me that love multiplies when you share it instead of diminishing. Helping other people won't make me love you less. It will help me love better." Sarah nodded, with the understanding of someone who had learned similar lessons about expanding rather than limiting emotional connections. "Like how loving you didn't mean we stopped loving our first mama. Some things get bigger when you add to them instead of smaller." That night, after the children were settled and baby Elizabeth was sleeping peacefully in her cradle, Catherine and James sat on their front porch, discussing the medical school opportunity and what it would mean for their family's future. "Are you truly comfortable with me pursuing formal medical training?" Catherine asked, studying her husband's face in the lamplight. "It will require time away from home and might change how people view our family." James reached for her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers in the gesture that had become their signal of partnership and mutual support. "Catherine, I fell in love with your intelligence, compassion, and strength," he replied. "Those qualities drew me to you, and they're exactly what will make you an exceptional physician. I would never ask you to diminish yourself to fit conventional expectations." The conversation continued past midnight as they planned practical arrangements for Catherine's medical education while maintaining their family's stability and happiness. By dawn, they had outlined a future that seemed both ambitious and achievable, built on the foundation of love and mutual respect that had sustained them through previous challenges. 3 months later, Catherine received her first formal medical textbooks and began the correspondence coursework that would eventually lead to her certification as Michigan's youngest licensed female physician. She studied by lamplight after the children were asleep, discussed cases with Dr. Morrison during their regular rounds, and traveled to Detroit quarterly for examinations and specialized training. The journey was demanding but deeply fulfilling. combining intellectual challenge with practical application in ways that utilized every aspect of her natural abilities and learned skills. More importantly, her medical career enhanced rather than competed with her role as wife and mother, providing additional income and community respect that benefited the entire Henderson family. 5 years after beginning her medical studies, Dr. Catherine Henderson established the first women's medical clinic in Western Michigan, specializing in maternal and child health services. The clinic served families throughout the region while training other women in basic medical skills, creating a network of healthcare providers in communities previously dependent on traveling physicians. On the clinic's opening day, Catherine stood before a crowd that included her 6 children, her proud husband, colleagues from the medical community, and neighbors who had watched her transformation from rejected wife to respected physician. The ceremony felt like vindication, not just for her own struggles, but for every woman who had been told her worth was measured solely by her ability to fulfill traditional expectations. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, addressing the gathering with confidence earned through years of proving herself in crisis after crisis, "this clinic represents hope for families who need medical care and opportunities for women who want to serve their communities through healing. But mostly, it represents the truth that worth comes from what we choose to give, not what we happen to produce." As applause echoed across the crowd, Catherine saw her journey reflected in the faces surrounding her, from the parents who had sold her as damaged goods, to the husband who had divorced her for failing to bear children, to the family who had embraced her for who she was rather than what she could provide. The woman who had once believed herself broken beyond repair had become a healer whose skills saved lives and whose example opened doors for other women to discover their own hidden strengths. Her legacy would extend far beyond her own family, touching countless lives through the medical care she provided and the barriers she helped break down. That evening, as Dr. Catherine Henderson returned home to the White House with green shutters, where her journey had begun, she found her family gathered around the dinner table, waiting for her arrival. 6 children, ranging from 22-year-old Michael to 6-year-old Elizabeth, rose to welcome her home, their faces glowing with pride in their mother's achievements. "How did the opening ceremony go?" James asked, embracing his wife with the same warmth he had shown during their courtship years earlier. "It went perfectly," Catherine replied, looking around at the family who had given her the courage to discover her true worth. Everything went exactly as it was meant to go. Outside, the Michigan sunset painted the sky in brilliant colors that seemed to celebrate new beginnings and fulfilled dreams. Inside the Henderson home, the woman who had been sold for her failures was surrounded by people who valued her for her successes, her love, and her unwavering determination to turn brokenness into healing for herself and others. The story that had begun with rejection and despair had become a testament to the transformative power of love, the importance of chosen family, and the truth that worth cannot be measured by society's narrow expectations, but only by the courage to become who you were always meant to be. 2 years later, Catherine Henderson stood in the doorway of her expanded kitchen, watching her husband James teach their newest addition to walk across the polished wooden floor. Little Elizabeth, now 18 months old and blessed with her father's determined blue eyes, took wobbling steps between James's outstretched arms and the kitchen table where Sarah was preparing Sunday dinner. The scene filled Catherine with a profound contentment she had never imagined possible during those dark months when her own parents had sold her like damaged livestock. The woman who had been told she was worthless because she couldn't bear children now watched her biological daughter take her first independent steps, surrounded by the 4 children who had claimed Catherine as their mother through choice rather than biology. "Mama Catherine," David called from the parlor where he was helping Daniel arrange wildflowers for the dinner table. Dr. Morrison is riding up the lane with his wife. Should I set 2 more places? At 11 years old, David showed no lasting effects from the pneumonia that had nearly claimed his life 2 Christmases ago. His easy use of Mama Catherine reflected the family's solution to honoring both their lost mother's memory and Catherine's vital place in their present lives. Of course, Catherine replied, smoothing her blue Sunday dress as she prepared to welcome guests who had become dear friends since her marriage to James. And ask Michael to bring more chairs from the dining room? Dr. Morrison's visits had become regular occurrences since Catherine had begun assisting him with particularly difficult medical cases throughout the county. Her exceptional skills with herbal remedies and emergency treatments had earned respect throughout Michigan's medical community, leading to informal consultations that supplemented the family's income while serving neighbors in need. Mrs. Henderson, Dr. Morrison said warmly as he entered the kitchen with his wife Margaret, "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I have news that couldn't wait until our scheduled meeting tomorrow." Catherine accepted Margaret's embrace while wondering what development could prompt such urgency. Over the past year, Dr. Morrison had been advocating for formal medical education programs that would allow women with natural healing abilities to receive professional training and certification. "The Michigan Medical Board has approved our proposal," Dr. Morrison announced, his face glowing with excitement. "Beginning this fall, qualified women will be admitted to a specialized medical training program in Detroit. Catherine, they want you to be among the first students." The news struck Catherine speechless. For months, Dr. Morrison had hinted about possibilities for expanding her medical role, but she had never dared hope for formal recognition of her abilities or opportunities. "For advanced education, medical school?" Sarah asked, her 17-year-old face showing pride mixed with concern. "Would that mean Mama Catherine would have to leave us?" James stepped forward, baby Elizabeth balanced on his hip, his expression revealing that this conversation had been anticipated and discussed privately between the adults. The program allows students to complete much of their coursework through correspondence and practical apprenticeships, James explained. Catherine could train with Dr. Morrison here while traveling to Detroit only for examinations and specialized instruction. Catherine felt her heart racing with possibility and uncertainty. The offer represented validation beyond anything she had imagined when her medical interventions had saved David's life, but it also suggested responsibilities that might conflict with her role as wife and mother to 6 children. "What would this mean for our family?" she asked carefully, looking around at faces that had become more precious to her than her own life. "It means," said 16-year-old Michael, with the wisdom of someone who had matured quickly through necessity, "that our mother would become the first licensed female physician in this part of Michigan. It means other families wouldn't have to fear losing children to illnesses you could treat." The teenager's perspective struck Catherine with sudden clarity about the broader implications of Dr. Morrison's offer. Her medical knowledge, gained through necessity and refined through crisis, could serve purposes far beyond her own family's needs. "Mama Catherine," Daniel said, now 11 and showing artistic talents that suggested a future in illustration or design, "remember when you told me that broken things can become useful in new ways? Maybe your broken marriage led you to healing skills that can help lots of people." The observation demonstrated an emotional intelligence that never ceased to amaze Catherine. These children, who had faced loss and disruption with remarkable resilience, understood concepts about growth through adversity that many adults never grasped. Margaret Morrison leaned forward with the enthusiasm of someone personally invested in the program's success. "Catherine, this opportunity could change how society views women's capabilities in medicine. Your combination of natural ability, practical experience, and formal education would make you uniquely qualified to bridge traditional healing practices with modern medical science." A Sunday dinner progressed around the extended table that accommodated the Morrison family, neighbors who had stopped by, and the 6 Henderson children. Catherine found herself at the center of animated discussions about her potential medical career. The conversation revealed how dramatically her reputation had evolved from suspected moral liability to community treasure. "Mrs. Worthington still spreads occasional gossip," admitted Mrs. Patterson, who had become one of Catherine's closest friends. "But most people remember how you saved the Miller baby during that difficult birth last spring." Actions speak louder than whispered judgments. The mention of Mrs. Worthington brought smiles rather than anxiety now. The former moral crusader had been forced to sell her property at a significant loss after her financial manipulations became public knowledge. She remained in Grand Rapids, but wielded considerably less social influence after her true motivations were exposed. "What happened to Mr. Brennan and his attorney?" asked Sarah, who had developed a keen interest in justice and legal matters since. Witnessing Catherine's vindication, both faced criminal charges for perjury and filing false documents, Dr. Morrison replied. Mr. Brennan paid substantial fines and legal costs, while attorney Blackwood lost his license to practice law in Michigan. Their scheme backfired spectacularly. Catherine felt no satisfaction in her former husband's downfall, only relief that his attempts to reclaim control over her life had ended in complete failure. Robert's defeat had been absolute, leaving her free to build the future she had chosen without fear of legal interference. As evening approached and guests departed, the Henderson family settled into their customary Sunday routine of reading, music, and quiet conversation. James played his harmonica while the children took turns sharing highlights from their week, a tradition that kept them connected despite increasingly busy individual schedules. "Mama Catherine," David said during a pause in the music, "will you really become a doctor?" Catherine looked around at her family, these people who had given her purpose and love when she believed herself worthless, realizing that her answer would affect not just her own future, but their understanding of what was possible for women in their changing world. "I think I will," she said slowly, testing the words as she spoke them, "but not because I want to leave this family, or because caring for you isn't important enough. Because the skills that help me take care of you could also help me take care of other families who need medical assistance." Little Elizabeth chose that moment to take 3 steps from her father's arms directly to Catherine, collapsing into her mother's lap with the triumphant giggle of someone who had achieved an important goal. The timing seemed symbolic of progress and new beginnings. Besides, Catherine added, cuddling her youngest daughter, "This family taught me that love multiplies when you share it instead of diminishing. Helping other people won't make me love you less. It will help me love better." Sarah nodded, with the understanding of someone who had learned similar lessons about expanding rather than limiting emotional connections. "Like how loving you didn't. We stopped loving our first mama. Some things get bigger when you add to them instead of smaller." That night, after the children were settled and baby Elizabeth was sleeping peacefully in her cradle, Catherine and James sat on their front porch discussing the medical school opportunity and what it would mean for their family's future. "Are you truly comfortable with me pursuing formal medical training?" Catherine asked, studying her husband's face in the lamplight. "It will require time away from home and might change how people view our family." James reached for her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers in the gesture that had become their signal of partnership and mutual support. "Catherine, I fell in love with your intelligence, compassion, and strength," he replied. "Those qualities drew me to you, and they're exactly what will make you an exceptional physician. I would never ask you to diminish yourself to fit conventional expectations." The conversation continued past midnight as they planned practical arrangements for Catherine's medical education while maintaining their family's stability and happiness. By dawn, They had outlined a future that seemed both ambitious and achievable, built on the foundation of love and mutual respect that had sustained them through previous challenges. 3 months later, Catherine received her first formal medical textbooks and began the correspondence coursework that would eventually lead to her certification as Michigan's youngest licensed female physician. She studied by lamplight after the children were asleep, discussed cases with Dr. Morrison during their regular rounds, and traveled to Detroit quarterly for examinations and specialized training. The journey was demanding but deeply fulfilling, combining intellectual challenge with practical application in ways that utilized every aspect of her natural abilities and learned skills. More importantly, her medical career enhanced rather than competed with her role as wife and mother, providing additional income and community respect that benefited the entire Henderson family. 5 years after beginning her medical studies, Dr. Catherine Henderson established the first women's medical clinic in Western Michigan, specializing in maternal and child health services. The clinic served families throughout the region while training other women in basic medical skills, creating a network of healthcare providers in communities previously dependent on traveling physicians. On the clinic's opening day, Catherine stood before a crowd that included her 6 children, her proud husband, colleagues from the medical community, and neighbors who had watched her transformation from rejected wife to respected physician. The ceremony felt like vindication, not just for her own struggles, but for every woman who had been told her worth was measured solely by her ability to fulfill traditional expectations. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, addressing the gathering with confidence earned through years of proving herself in crisis after crisis, "this clinic represents hope for families who need medical care and opportunities for women who want to serve their communities through healing. But mostly it represents the truth that worth comes from what we choose to give, not what we happen to produce." As applause echoed across the crowd, Catherine saw her journey reflected in the faces surrounding her, from the parents who had sold her as damaged goods, to the husband who had divorced her for failing to bear children, to the family who had embraced her for who she was rather than what she could provide. The woman who had once believed herself broken beyond repair had become a healer whose skills saved lives and whose example opened doors for other women to discover their own hidden strengths. Her legacy would extend far beyond her own family, touching countless lives through the medical care she provided and the barriers she helped break down. That evening, as Dr. Catherine Henderson returned home to the White House with green shutters, where her journey had begun, she found her family gathered around the dinner table, waiting for her arrival. 6 children ranging from 22-year-old Michael to 6-year-old Elizabeth rose to welcome her home, their faces glowing with pride in their mother's achievements. "How did the opening ceremony go?" James asked, embracing his wife with the same warmth he had shown during their courtship years earlier. "It went perfectly," Catherine replied, looking around at the family who had given her the courage to discover her true worth. Everything went exactly as it was meant to go. Outside, the Michigan sunset painted the sky in brilliant colors that seemed to celebrate new beginnings and fulfilled dreams. Inside the Henderson home, the woman who had been sold for her failures was surrounded by people who valued her for her successes, her love, and her unwavering determination to turn brokenness into healing for herself and others. The story that had begun with rejection and despair had become a testament to the transformative power of love, the importance of chosen family, and the truth that worth cannot be measured by society's narrow expectations, but only by the courage to become who you were always meant to be. 10 years after establishing her clinic, Dr. Catherine Henderson received an invitation that would have seemed impossible during her darkest days. The Michigan Medical Association requested her presence as keynote speaker at their annual conference in Detroit, making her the first woman ever invited to address the state's most prestigious gathering of physicians. Standing before 300 male doctors in the grand ballroom of Detroit's finest hotel, Catherine felt the weight of every woman who had been told her dreams were too ambitious, her abilities too limited, her worth too small to matter. The speech she delivered that autumn evening would be reprinted in medical journals across the country and quoted by suffragettes fighting for women's rights. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the ornate hall, "I stand before you not as an exception to prove that women lack medical capability, but as evidence that our profession has been incomplete without the perspectives and skills that women bring to healing." She spoke about her grandmother's wisdom, passed down through generations of women who had served as midwives and healers in communities too remote for formal medical care. She described cases where her supposed weaknesses as a woman had actually provided advantages in treating frightened children, exhausted mothers, and elderly patients who needed compassion as much as clinical expertise. "The qualities that society once told me made me worthless as a wife. My inability to bear children easily, my tendency to ask too many questions, my refusal to accept suffering as inevitable. These same qualities have made me effective as a physician," Catherine continued. "Perhaps we should reconsider which human characteristics we value and which we dismiss." The audience's initial skepticism gradually transformed into respectful attention as Catherine presented case studies, demonstrating innovative treatments she had developed for childhood diseases, maternal complications, and elderly care. Her combination of traditional herbal knowledge with modern medical science had produced survival rates that exceeded those of many urban hospitals. Following her speech, Catherine was approached by Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman to graduate from medical school in America, who had traveled from New York specifically to meet Michigan's pioneering female physician. "My dear Catherine," Dr. Blackwell said, her eyes bright with tears of pride, "you have accomplished something I thought might take another generation to achieve. You've proven that women can excel in medicine without abandoning their roles as mothers and wives." The encounter led to a correspondence that would span decades, as Catherine and Dr. Blackwell collaborated on establishing medical education programs specifically designed for women with families. Their work created pathways for dozens of women to enter medicine while maintaining their domestic responsibilities. Back in Grand Rapids, Catherine's expanding influence brought unexpected visitors to the Henderson household. Young women from across the Midwest arrived seeking apprenticeships in her clinic, drawn by stories of a female doctor who had overcome seemingly impossible obstacles to build a successful practice. Among these visitors was Rebecca Martinez, a Mexican-American woman whose family had been discriminated against by traditional physicians. Rebecca possessed exceptional natural healing abilities, but had been denied access to formal medical training because of both her gender and her heritage. "Dr. Henderson," Rebecca said during her interview, "I've heard that you judge people by their skills and character rather than their backgrounds. Is it true that you might train someone like me?" Catherine looked at this intelligent young woman whose situation reminded her of her own desperate search for opportunities, recognizing the hunger for purpose and respect that she remembered so well from her own darkest days. "Rebecca, if you're willing to work harder than you've ever worked before, to study by candlelight after 16-hour days in the clinic, and to prove your worth through results rather than credentials, then yes, I'll train you," Catherine replied. The apprenticeship program Catherine developed became a model copied throughout the country, creating a network of female medical practitioners who served communities previously lacking adequate health care. Her students carried not just medical knowledge, but also the philosophy that worth comes from service rather than social status. As her professional reputation grew, Catherine never forgot the family that had made her transformation possible. The Henderson children, now adults building their own lives, remained close-knit despite pursuing diverse paths that reflected the broad education and high expectations Catherine and James had provided. Michael had indeed become a teacher, establishing a progressive school that educated both boys and girls in advanced subjects typically reserved for wealthy urban students. His pedagogy reflected lessons learned from watching Catherine prove that intelligence and capability couldn't be judged by conventional standards. Sarah married Dr. Morrison's son and became a nurse, working alongside Catherine in the clinic while raising 3 children of her own. Her ability to balance professional and family responsibilities demonstrated that the next generation of women wouldn't have to choose between career and motherhood the way their mothers had. David channeled his near-death experience into a career as a minister, serving rural communities where his practical approach to spirituality and his understanding of real suffering made him beloved by congregations across Michigan. His sermons often referenced the healing power of love and acceptance he had witnessed in his own family. Daniel's artistic talents led him to become an illustrator for medical textbooks, creating detailed anatomical drawings that were used in schools throughout the Midwest. His work helped democratize medical education by making complex concepts accessible to students who couldn't afford expensive, imported texts. Little Elizabeth, now 16 and showing signs of inheriting both her mother's medical interests and her father's business acumen, spent her afternoons working in Catherine's clinic while maintaining the highest academic standing in Grand Rapids' most challenging preparatory program. "Mama," Elizabeth said one evening as they reviewed patient files together, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if Grandpa Dalton hadn't sold you to the Hendersons?" The question prompted Catherine to reflect on the circuitous path that had led from humiliation and despair to fulfillment and respect. Every hardship, every rejection, every moment of feeling worthless had been necessary to bring her to this place where she could serve others while surrounded by love. "I think everything happened exactly as it needed to happen," Catherine replied. "The pain taught me empathy for other people's suffering. The rejection made me value acceptance when I found it. The belief that I was broken prepared me to help heal others who felt the same way." On her 50th birthday, Catherine stood in her expanded clinic, now staffed by 6 female physicians and serving patients from 5 counties, reading letters from former students who had established their own practices across the country. Each letter represented a life touched by the ripple effects of her transformation from discarded wife to respected healer. Among the correspondence was a package from her nephew in Kansas containing items salvaged from her parents' estate after their deaths. Inside, she found her grandmother's medical journals, detailed records of herbal treatments and birthing techniques that had been passed down through generations of women healers. Reading her grandmother's careful notes about treating pneumonia, difficult births, and childhood fevers, Catherine realized that her medical knowledge had deeper roots than she had understood. The wisdom that had saved David's life and launched her career connected her to a legacy of women who had always been healers, even when society refused to recognize their contributions. "James," she said that evening, sharing the journals with her husband as they sat on the same front porch where he had first proposed, "I think I finally understand why everything happened the way it did. I was never broken. I was being prepared." James, now 52 and still running the lumber mill that had expanded into one of Michigan's most successful businesses, looked at his wife with the same wonder he had felt when first recognizing her. "Strength and intelligence. Prepared for what?" he asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. To prove that worth isn't something society grants or withholds, Catherine replied. It's something we discover and develop and share with others who need to learn the same lesson. As stars appeared in the familiar Michigan sky, Catherine reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from the wagon where her father had tried to sell her like livestock to this porch where she sat as a respected physician, beloved, wife, and cherished mother. The woman who had once believed herself worthless had created worth not just for herself, but for countless others who had been similarly discarded or dismissed. Her legacy would continue through the women she had trained, the patients she had healed, the children she had raised, and the example she had set of transforming brokenness into strength. In the distance, a night bird called to its mate through the darkness, and Catherine smiled at the sound of connection and belonging that had once seemed impossible, but now surrounded her like the embrace of a family that had chosen love over convention, possibility over limitation, and hope over despair. The story that had begun with a price tag had become priceless, proving that the most valuable things in life cannot be bought or sold, but only discovered, nurtured, and shared with grateful hearts that understand the true meaning of worth. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.